In the autumn of 1856, along the mist-shrouded banks of the Scioto River in northern Ohio, 3 infant boys were born during a night of such strange, astronomical phenomena that local newspapers documented it as the evening when stars fell to earth. These triplets, delivered in the hidden root cellar of an isolated farmhouse, would develop abilities so profound and inexplicable that their case remains sealed in medical archives to this day. For nearly 2 centuries, their descendants have guarded dark truths about what these children could perceive. Truths that, if fully revealed, would force us to question everything we believe about the boundaries between life and death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because what you're about to hear happened not in some distant land of myth and legend, but here in America, perhaps in communities surprisingly close to your own. The story I'm about to tell began on a cold October night when 3 lives entered this world under circumstances so unusual that they set in motion a chain of events that continues to baffle medical experts and paranormal researchers alike. The town of Millersport, Ohio hardly warranted mention on maps in 1856. With barely 250 residents, it consisted of little more than a lumber mill, a general store, a small Methodist church, and scattered farmhouses connected by muddy roads that became nearly impassable during the frequent autumn rains. Unlike the growing industrial centers just 50 miles south, Millersport remained isolated, a place where old traditions and older superstitions still held sway. The Miller family had lived on their modest farmstead for 3 generations, the current patriarch being Thomas Miller, a somber, intensely private man whose weathered face and calloused hands spoke of a lifetime of hard labor. His wife Margaret, known throughout the region for her knowledge of herbal remedies and midwifery skills, had earned both respect and whispered suspicion from those who found her intuitive abilities unsettling. What few people knew was that the Miller farm served a purpose beyond agriculture. Beneath the worn floorboards of their barn lay a carefully constructed root cellar that had been expanded over the years into a spacious underground chamber. This hidden space had become a crucial waypoint for those fleeing north in search of freedom. The Millers had been part of this dangerous work for almost a decade, risking everything to provide shelter to those who arrived in the dead of night. Guided by nothing more than whispered directions and the North Star, October of 1856 had been unusually tense for those involved in this clandestine network. Federal marshals had intensified their patrols following the passage of increasingly stringent fugitive slave laws. Bounty hunters roamed freely through Ohio, emboldened by new legal protections and the substantial rewards offered for the capture of both escaped slaves and those who aided them. The atmosphere in Millersport was one of constant vigilance, where a stranger's arrival could signal either a soul in desperate need or the beginning of catastrophe. It was against this backdrop of fear and determination that a young woman arrived at the Miller farm one storm-lashed night in mid-October. She had given her name only as Elizabeth, appeared to be no more than 20 years old, and was in the advanced stages of pregnancy. Thomas Miller had taken one look at her exhausted face and known immediately that she would be staying longer than most who passed through their hidden sanctuary. Margaret Miller, who had helped deliver more than 60 children throughout the county, recognized at once that this pregnancy was unusual. "She's carrying more than one child," she told her husband after examining Elizabeth. "And they'll be coming soon, much sooner than she believes." What neither of the Millers could have anticipated was how Elizabeth's arrival would forever alter not just their lives, but our understanding of human potential itself. From the moment she entered their home, strange occurrences began to manifest. The milk in their pantry soured overnight. Animals in the barn became inexplicably agitated when she approached. Most disturbing were the dreams that plagued everyone in the household. Vivid nightmares of dark figures moving through mist-filled forests, always searching, always coming closer. Elizabeth herself seemed oblivious to these disturbances. She spoke little of her past, revealing only that she had fled from a plantation in Kentucky where she had worked in the main house. Her speech was refined, her manners impeccable, suggesting an upbringing or position different from most who traveled the Underground Railroad. But there was something in her eyes that troubled Margaret, a knowing depth that seemed impossible in someone so young. "She sees things," Margaret confided to her journal, a document discovered decades later hidden within the farmhouse walls. "Not as others do. When she looks at you, it's as if she's seeing straight through to something beyond. And sometimes she knows things she couldn't possibly know." On the third evening after her arrival, Elizabeth had calmly informed the Millers that 3 men would be coming to their door before midnight, 1 seeking shelter, 2 harboring ill intent. Thomas had dismissed this as the anxiety of a pregnant woman far from home, until precisely such a scenario unfolded. The Millers' quick thinking and Elizabeth's warning had averted disaster, but the incident left them deeply shaken. How could she have known? The night of October 28, 1856, began with an astronomical event, so unusual that it was recorded in local newspapers across northern Ohio. A meteor shower of extraordinary intensity illuminated the sky, accompanied by strange atmospheric phenomena that caused the air itself to seem charged with electricity. Farmers reported livestock becoming unnaturally agitated, while household objects reportedly moved without being touched. Later scientific analysis would suggest a rare combination of meteorological and astronomical events, but those who lived through that night described it in more mystical terms: the evening when stars fell to earth. It was against this backdrop of celestial disturbance that Elizabeth's labor began. The contractions came suddenly and with such intensity that Margaret immediately knew this birth would be unlike any she had attended before. Thomas was sent to fetch his sister Mary, the only other person trusted with knowledge of their hidden guests, while Margaret prepared the root cellar for what would surely be a difficult delivery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What happened in the next 12 hours would defy every natural law Margaret thought she understood about childbirth. As the meteor shower reached its peak intensity overhead, Elizabeth entered a state unlike normal labor. She made no sounds of pain or distress. Her breathing remained perfectly steady. Most unsettling to Margaret was Elizabeth's complete lucidity. She spoke calmly throughout the process, as if engaged in ordinary conversation rather than bringing new life into the world. "They're waiting," Elizabeth said repeatedly, her eyes fixed on the rough-hewn ceiling above. "They've been waiting for tonight, for this sky, for these stars." The first child emerged shortly after midnight, delivered with such ease that Margaret could hardly believe what she was witnessing. The infant, a perfectly formed boy with alert dark eyes, made no sound. No crying, no gasping for first breath. He simply gazed at his surroundings with an awareness that seemed impossible in a newborn. Before Margaret could even process what she was seeing, a second infant arrived, identical to the first, and demonstrating the same unnatural composure. The third boy was born exactly as the meteor shower reached its final, most spectacular display, the sky above the farm illuminated as bright as midday for a brief, impossible moment. Like his brothers, he entered the world in complete silence, eyes open and watchful. Margaret's journal entry, written with a shaking hand the following morning, captures her profound disquiet. "I have delivered 67 children before last night, and witnessed the miracle of first breath in each one. Every child born announces their arrival with cries that tell us they live. These 3 made no sound, yet they breathe. Yet they watch. God help me, but I cannot escape the feeling that they were not simply born last night, they arrived." The strangeness of the triplets' birth was only the beginning. As Margaret examined the infants, she discovered other anomalies that defied medical explanation. All three boys shared identical birthmarks, a small perfectly circular mark at the base of their skulls. Their body temperatures were noticeably lower than normal, yet they showed no signs of distress. Most disturbing to Margaret was their continued silence. Hours after birth, when hunger should have prompted crying, the three infants remained utterly quiet, their dark eyes tracking every movement in the room. Elizabeth, recovering with remarkable speed, seemed unsurprised by these peculiarities. "They don't need to cry," she told Margaret. "They have other ways of being heard." That cryptic statement took on new meaning in the days that followed. Thomas Miller, returning from town with supplies 3 days after the birth, reported troubling development. Federal marshals had been seen in Millersport, asking questions about recent travelers. More concerning was their specific interest in a young pregnant woman. They had descriptions matching Elizabeth, right down to the blue ribbon she wore around her wrist. "They know she's here," Thomas told his wife in hushed tones, careful to keep Elizabeth from overhearing. Someone must have talked. But when they returned to the root cellar to warn Elizabeth, they found her already packing her few belongings. "We need to leave tonight," she said without looking up. "They'll be here by morning." When Thomas asked how she could possibly know this, Elizabeth finally shared a truth she had kept hidden. The plantation she had fled was owned by a man named Edward Harrison, a wealthy gentleman with political connections that reached all the way to Washington. What made her particularly valuable to him wasn't her labor, but something far more personal. "The father of my children is Harrison's son," she explained, her voice devoid of emotion. "They discovered I was with child and kept me isolated, planning to study the babies once they were born. They've long suspected something about my bloodline, about the women in my family. We know things others don't, see things others can't." Elizabeth went on to describe generations of women in her family who possessed unusual perceptive abilities, an innate sense that allowed them to detect deception, foresee danger, and sometimes glimpse fragments of possible futures. These abilities had been both blessing and curse, keeping them alive through impossible circumstances, but also making them targets for those who would exploit such gifts. "Harrison believes my children will inherit these abilities, but stronger." The physician on the plantation had theories about male children manifesting these traits more powerfully. "That's why they're hunting me with such determination. Not just as property, but as specimens." The Millers, devout Methodists who had always been uncomfortable with anything that hinted at the supernatural, might have dismissed this as fantasy under other circumstances. But they had witnessed too many inexplicable things since Elizabeth's arrival to doubt her now. The spoiled milk, the animal's strange behavior, her accurate prediction about the visitors, and most convincingly, the unnatural awareness of the three infants who even now seemed to be listening to their mother's every word. With federal marshals closing in, immediate action was required. The established escape routes were too well known to be safe. Instead, Thomas proposed a desperate alternative. A local Seneca man named Joseph, who lived in the forests outside town and occasionally traded with the Miller family, might be willing to guide Elizabeth and her children to a remote settlement. In Canada, Thomas left immediately to find Joseph, while Margaret helped Elizabeth prepare for the journey. It was during these preparations that Elizabeth made a request that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. "If something happens to me," Elizabeth said, placing a small leather pouch in Margaret's hands, "promise you'll protect my sons. They're going to need guardians who understand what they are." Inside the pouch was a journal written in Elizabeth's careful hand, detailing the history of her family's unusual abilities across 7 generations. The final pages contained her observations during pregnancy, dreams of her sons communicating with her before birth, sensations of their thoughts touching hers, and most disturbing, her conviction that they had chosen the precise night of their birth to coincide with the meteor shower. "The veil between worlds is thinnest when the sky changes," one passage read. They waited for this night. They knew. Margaret, overwhelmed by these revelations and the immediate danger facing them all, made the promise. How could she have known then the true weight of what she was agreeing to? How could anyone have predicted what those 3 silent infants would eventually become? Joseph arrived near midnight, his weathered face betraying no emotion when presented with Elizabeth and her unusual infants. He simply nodded and outlined a path that would take them through waterways and forests, avoiding roads and settlements, where marshals might be watching. They would travel by night, resting during daylight in hidden locations Joseph had used for years to help people journey north. As Elizabeth prepared to leave, a final chilling incident occurred that confirmed the unusual nature of her children. While Margaret held one of the infants, the child's previously dark eyes suddenly lightened to an impossible pale blue, the exact shade of Joseph's eyes. The infant turned its head toward the north wall of the root cellar, and within moments, they heard the distant sound of approaching horses. Federal marshals, Joseph confirmed after slipping outside to investigate. At least 6 riders coming fast. What followed was a desperate race against time. While Thomas and Mary created a diversion at the main house, Margaret led Elizabeth, Joseph, and the triplets through a narrow tunnel that connected the root cellar to a dry creek bed behind the property. The night was moonless, the earlier celestial display having given way to clouded skies that would help conceal their escape. But something went wrong. Perhaps it was bad luck, or perhaps the pursuers had more information than seemed possible. As the group emerged from the creek bed into the shelter of the forest, shouts erupted behind them. Lanterns illuminated the darkness. The marshals had somehow anticipated their escape route. Joseph made an instant decision, taking one of the infants from Elizabeth's arms. "Split up," he instructed. "They can't follow all of us." Margaret, acting on instinct rather than any rational plan, took another of the babies. Elizabeth clutched the 3rd child tightly to her chest, her face reflecting momentary panic before settling into resolved determination. "Meet at the Lightning Oak," Joseph said quickly. 3 days. If anyone is missing, continue north with whoever remains. With those hurried instructions, the group separated into the darkness, each following different paths into the dense forest. What happened next has been pieced together from multiple sources: Margaret's later journal entries, local newspaper accounts of the night's events, and federal records that remained sealed until 1963. Margaret, carrying one of the triplets, managed to evade the immediate pursuit by hiding in a hollow log as riders thundered past. The infant in her arms remained supernaturally silent throughout the ordeal, its dark eyes reflecting the distant lantern light without fear. When morning came, she made her way to a sympathetic farmer's home, where she had previously arranged emergency shelter for escaped travelers. Joseph, with decades of experience moving unseen through these forests, successfully evaded the marshals and reached temporary safety with the 2nd child. According to his later testimony, the infant slept peacefully through their flight, waking only once when they crossed a stream, at which point the child's eyes had momentarily changed color again, taking on the same deep brown as Joseph's own. Elizabeth was not so fortunate. Slowed by her recent childbirth and exhaustion, she was overtaken less than a mile from the farm. What happened next was reported in the Millersport Gazette as a tragic accident during the lawful apprehension of a fugitive, but federal records tell a different story. Elizabeth was shot twice while attempting to flee with her child. As she fell, according to the marshal's own report, she shielded the infant with her body, whispering something to the child that none of the men could hear. By the time the marshals reached her, Elizabeth was dead. The infant she had been carrying was taken into custody and transported to Columbus, where records show it was delivered to a physician named Dr. William Crawford, who had connections to the Harrison plantation in Kentucky. The ultimate fate of this child remains one of the central mysteries in this story. though fragments of evidence suggest a chilling possibility we'll explore shortly. The planned rendezvous at the Lightning Oak, a massive tree scarred by repeated lightning strikes that served as a landmark for those traveling the Underground Railroad, took place 3 days later as arranged. Margaret arrived with the infant in her care, having successfully avoided further detection. Joseph appeared several hours later with the second child. Both immediately realized the terrible truth. Elizabeth had been captured or killed, and the third triplet was lost to them. A decision had to be made. To continue north with the 2 remaining children would be the safest course, but both Margaret and Joseph felt a profound responsibility toward the missing infant. However, practicality prevailed. 2 newborns could not be abandoned, and the risk of attempting to rescue the third was too great. "We will save those we can," Joseph said simply, "and remember the one we lost." The journey north took nearly 3 weeks, following remote paths through forests and across waterways. Throughout this harrowing travel, the 2 infants demonstrated the same unnatural composure they had shown since birth. They rarely cried, seemed untroubled by hunger or cold, and continued to exhibit the strange awareness that had so disturbed Margaret from the beginning. "They watch everything," she wrote in a journal entry dated November 17, 1856, "not as infants should, with the unfocused gaze of newborns, but with purpose and recognition. Sometimes I catch them looking at each other in a way that makes me think they're communicating, though how this could be possible I cannot say. More disturbing still is my growing certainty that they understand our conversations, even at barely 3 weeks old." The group eventually reached a small settlement near Lake Erie, where Joseph had connections with a community of mixed native and European descent who lived largely separate from broader society. Here, the children would be safe from both slave catchers and those who might be interested in their unusual nature. Margaret made the painful decision to return to Millersport. Her family needed her, and her sudden disappearance had already raised questions that could endanger the larger network of people helping travelers north. Joseph agreed to ensure the children's safety and see that they were raised with knowledge of their origins. Before parting, Margaret shared with Joseph the contents of Elizabeth's journal, including the history of unusual abilities in her family line. Joseph received this information without surprise. "There have always been those who see beyond the veil," he told her. "My people have stories of such children born during sky fires." Margaret's return to Millersport was met with suspicion. Federal marshals questioned her about the night of Elizabeth's death, but without evidence of her direct involvement, they eventually focused their attention elsewhere. Thomas Miller, however, faced more serious consequences. Their farm was searched repeatedly, the hidden root cellar discovered, and Thomas was arrested for violations of the Fugitive Slave Act. He spent 6 months in prison before being released, his health permanently damaged by the experience. The Millers lost their farm and were ostracized by many in the community who feared association with known abolitionists. Yet despite these hardships, Margaret maintained contact with Joseph through a carefully arranged system of messages carried by traveling peddlers. It was through these communications that she learned of the triplets' development over the following years. The 2 boys, named Benjamin and Samuel by the community that had taken them in, were growing normally in physical terms but continued to display abilities that defied explanation. By their first birthday, they had begun speaking, not the simple words typical of children that age, but in complete, grammatically complex sentences. More unsettling were their continued moments of synchronicity. They would turn simultaneously toward approaching visitors long before any sound announced their arrival. They could unfailingly identify dishonesty in those around them, turning away from even well-intentioned falsehoods. And they continued to communicate with each other in ways that suggested something beyond normal sibling bonds. They don't always need to speak aloud to understand each other. Joseph wrote to Margaret in the spring of 1858, "They share dreams. When one learns something, the other knows it too. And they continue to ask about their brother. Not as children ask, with confusion or simple curiosity, but with purpose. They believe he is alive. They claim they can still feel him. This last observation would prove prophetic in ways Joseph could not have imagined. The missing triplet, the one taken after Elizabeth's death, had indeed survived. Federal records, unearthed a century later, revealed that the child had been transported to a private research facility outside Columbus, funded by Edward Harrison. The plantation owner Elizabeth had fled. There, under the supervision of Dr. William Crawford, the infant became the subject of intensive study. Crawford, a physician with controversial theories about human perception and consciousness, had been tasked with determining whether the child possessed the unusual traits Harrison believed would be present. Crawford's research journal, discovered in a university archive in 1972, documents the third triplet's development in clinical, often disturbing detail. The boy, given the research designation Subject C rather than a name, displayed the same accelerated development as his brothers. He spoke in full sentences by 12 months, demonstrated perfect recall of anything he observed, and showed an uncanny ability to perceive the emotions and intentions of those around him. Subject C appears capable of detecting falsehood with perfect accuracy, Crawford wrote when the child was 18 months old. When presented with deliberately false statements, he becomes visibly distressed and will not respond. More remarkably, he can distinguish between different types of deception: ignorant error, deliberate misdirection, or lies told with benevolent intent. This suggests a form of perception that goes beyond reading physical cues or voice patterns. As the child grew older, Crawford's experiments became more elaborate. By age 3, Subject C was being tested against adults specifically trained to conceal their thoughts and emotions. Military personnel, skilled poker players, and trained actors were brought in to determine the limits of the child's perceptive abilities. None could successfully deceive him. Most disturbing were Crawford's attempts to understand whether these abilities could function at a distance. In one experiment, individuals unknown to the child were stationed in separate buildings up to a mile away. Each was given an envelope containing instructions to either tell the truth or lie about their activities when later questioned. Subject C, without any prior knowledge of these individuals or their locations, was able to correctly identify which ones had followed the deception instructions with an accuracy rate of over 90%. We are forced to consider possibilities that extend beyond current scientific understanding, Crawford wrote in 1860, when the child was 4 years old. The subject's abilities cannot be explained through conventional sensory mechanisms. We appear to be documenting a form of perception that operates independently of distance and physical barriers. What Crawford and his research team failed to anticipate was that Subject C's abilities were continuing to evolve, and that the child was far more aware of his situation than they realized. The clinical environment, the endless tests, the emotional detachment of his handlers, all were shaping him in ways very different from his brothers in the northern settlement. And all the while, though separated by hundreds of miles, the three triplets remained connected by a bond that transcended normal human understanding. Benjamin and Samuel, growing up in the free community near Lake Erie, began to experience dreams and visions that seemed to show fragments of their brother's life. They would wake simultaneously in the night, describing identical images of sterile rooms, men in formal clothes, and endless questions. By their 5th birthday, the connection had strengthened to the point where Joseph became seriously concerned. The boys wake with bruises that match the experiments performed on their brother, he wrote to Margaret. They know things about medical procedures and scientific equipment that they could not possibly have learned here. And they speak of plans to find him with such certainty that I believe they will attempt it, with or without our help. This connection worked both ways. Crawford's journals note with increasing alarm that Subject C was exhibiting knowledge. he could not possibly have acquired in the research facility, describing forests, lakes, and native ceremonies in precise detail. More concerning to Crawford was the child's growing assertion that he was not alone, that he had brothers who were coming for him, and that soon everything would change. The impending Civil War created new tensions and dangers. As 1861 approached, and the country moved inexorably toward conflict, both the settlement where Benjamin and Samuel lived and the research facility housing Subject C faced new threats. The political chaos and divided loyalties of the pre-war period meant that old protections were dissolving and new alliances forming. Crawford's research, previously shielded by powerful political connections, came under scrutiny from Union officials concerned about potential applications of his work to military intelligence. Edward Harrison, whose plantation wealth had funded the research, faced financial pressure as war became inevitable. Simultaneously, the remote community sheltering Benjamin and Samuel was experiencing increased contact with the outside world as regional militias formed and young men were recruited for the coming conflict. The isolation that had protected the unusual children for 5 years was breaking down. It was against this backdrop of growing chaos that Margaret Miller made a fateful decision. Now widowed after Thomas's death from illness contracted during his imprisonment, she had spent years rebuilding her life while maintaining secret contact with Joseph and the children. The approaching war presented both danger and opportunity. In the confusion, it might be possible to attempt what had previously seemed impossible, rescuing the third triplet from Crawford's facility. Using connections from her years with the Underground Railroad, Margaret began gathering information about the research center's location, security, and routines. Joseph, though now in his 60s, agreed to help, recognizing that Benjamin and Samuel's connection to their brother was growing stronger and more distressing with each passing month. "They wake screaming from shared nightmares," he reported. In early 1861, they draw pictures of machines and instruments they've never seen, and they speak of their brother's pain as if experiencing it themselves. "Whatever connects these children is beyond my understanding, but I believe it may kill them if we don't reunite them." The rescue plan took shape over several months of careful preparation. A sympathetic nurse working in Crawford's facility provided crucial details about the building's layout and Subject C's daily routine. Former Underground Railroad conductors mapped escape routes that would allow them to leave Ohio quickly if necessary. Everything was in place for an attempt in early summer of 1861. Then came the event that would transform this already extraordinary story into something that continues to challenge our understanding of human consciousness. On the night of May 17, 1861, Benjamin and Samuel, now 5.5 years old, disappeared from the settlement. Joseph discovered their absence at dawn and immediately began searching, but found no trace of the children or any indication of how they had left or where they might have gone. 2 days later, Dr. Crawford arrived at his research facility to find an inexplicable scene. Subject C was missing from his room, the door still locked from the outside, the windows securely fastened. More perplexing were the reports from overnight staff who claimed they had seen 3 identical children in the hallway outside the laboratory. 3 children, when only one should have been in the building. The subsequent investigation yielded no explanation for how Benjamin and Samuel could have traveled hundreds of miles, infiltrated a secure facility, and disappeared with their brother without being captured. No children matching their description were reported on any roads or settlements between the northern community and Columbus. It was as if they had simply vanished from one location and materialized at another. Margaret, who had been preparing to implement the rescue plan, received a letter from Joseph a week after the disappearance. "They did what we could not. They found each other. I cannot explain how they accomplished this, but I believe with complete certainty that the 3 are together now. Where they have gone, I cannot say, but they are no longer alone. This miraculous reunion might have been the end of the story. 3 extraordinary children escaping the control of those who would exploit their abilities, disappearing into the vastness of a country on the brink of war. But the triplet story was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. Reports began emerging from military encampments across Ohio. In the late summer of 1861, Union officers described encounters with 3 identical boys who appeared without warning and delivered specific, detailed intelligence about Confederate positions and plans. The children would materialize near command tents, provide information that consistently proved accurate, and vanish before they could be questioned further. Initially dismissed as camp folklore or coincidence, these reports gained credibility when the intelligence they provided led to several significant Union victories. Military records from this period, declassified in 1947, contain dozens of references to the triplet informants and their uncanny ability to know things that should have been impossible for anyone outside high-level Confederate command to know. General William Sherman, in a private letter to his brother in September 1861, wrote, "We have benefited 3 times now from intelligence brought by the most unusual sources imaginable. 3 young boys, identical in every feature, who appear without warning and speak with the gravity of seasoned officers. Their information about enemy positions and intentions has proven correct in every instance. I cannot explain their existence or the source of their knowledge, but I have learned not to discount it." The most remarkable aspect of these appearances was the boys' apparent ability to move undetected through battle lines, appearing in secure locations without triggering alarms or being spotted by sentries. Multiple witnesses described the same uncanny pattern. The children would simply be there, standing quietly until noticed, delivering their information in perfect unison, and disappearing when attention was momentarily directed elsewhere. As the war intensified throughout 1861, military leaders on both sides became increasingly aware of the triplets' extraordinary capabilities. What had initially been dismissed as coincidence or exaggeration was now documented in classified reports, sent directly to Washington. The boys, now known to a select few as Benjamin Samuel and Christopher, the name secretly given to the formerly designated Subject C, continued their mysterious appearances, materializing in secure locations, with critical intelligence that repeatedly changed the course of battles. In December 1861, the triplets appeared in the private quarters of President Lincoln himself, bypassing multiple layers of security to deliver warnings about a planned assassination attempt. Secret Service records, sealed until 1962, detail how the president was found in conversation with 3 identical children who somehow knew details about Confederate sympathizers within the White House staff. The plot was foiled, the conspirators arrested, and Lincoln became personally interested in the mysterious triplets. "They are not what they appear to be," Lincoln wrote in a private journal entry recently discovered in a collection of his personal papers. "While they have the forms of children, their eyes hold knowledge that belongs to much older souls. They speak of events yet to come with the same certainty that others speak of the past. I find myself believing them, though such belief challenges everything I understand about the natural world." The president authorized the creation of a special department within the War Office, officially designated as Strategic Intelligence Assessment, but referred to in private correspondence as the Triplet Division. Its sole purpose was to document and analyze the information provided during the boys' unpredictable appearances. A dozen carefully selected officers were assigned to this unit, sworn to secrecy, and instructed to create protocols for verifying and acting upon the triplets' intelligence. What no one in the military or government fully grasped was that the boys were not acting out of patriotic duty or political allegiance. Their motivation, revealed later in documents they themselves created, was both simpler and more profound. They were attempting to minimize suffering. Their extraordinary perceptive abilities allowed them to foresee the consequences of military decisions, to literally sense the deaths that would result from various strategies and movements. By selectively providing information to Union commanders, they were quietly steering the conflict toward outcomes that would preserve the most lives. Dr. James Holloway, a physician assigned to the Triplet Division, conducted the first systematic study of the boys' abilities in early 1862. His findings, preserved in leather-bound journals discovered in a trunk in his great-granddaughter's attic in 1978, provide the first scientific attempt to understand what the triplets could actually perceive. The subjects demonstrate an unprecedented form of sensory perception that defies current medical understanding. Holloway wrote, "When tested using standard protocols for assessing vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, they show normal or slightly above average capabilities. However, they consistently demonstrate awareness of information that cannot be acquired through these conventional senses." Holloway devised increasingly complex experiments to map the boundaries of the triplets' perceptive abilities. In one test, military personnel in separate locations, miles from the testing facility, were instructed to either write truthful or false statements about their activities. The triplets could identify with 100% accuracy which individuals were creating deceptive accounts, despite having no sensory contact with them. In another experiment, objects with emotional significance, wedding rings, letters from deceased loved ones, medals from battles, were concealed in opaque containers. The triplets could consistently identify the emotional history attached to each object, describing in detail the experiences of its owner. Most remarkably, they could distinguish between genuine artifacts and replica items, created specifically to test their abilities. It appears that certain forms of information leave invisible traces that these children can somehow detect, Holloway theorized. Emotional states, intentions, and deceptive thoughts seem to create patterns or residues that are imperceptible to normal human senses but completely accessible to the triplets. Beyond these controlled experiments, the boys continued to demonstrate abilities that extended beyond mere unusual perception. They maintained their mysterious connection to each other, seemingly able to share thoughts without speaking. They could identify individuals who would later commit violent acts, describing with disturbing precision the emotional patterns that preceded such behavior. And perhaps most usefully to the military, they could detect the presence and nature of deception in enemy communications with perfect accuracy. Yet despite the obvious strategic advantage their abilities provided, the triplets remained fundamentally uncontrollable. They appeared when they chose to, shared only the information they deemed appropriate, and vanished when they wished. Attempts to detain them for more systematic study invariably failed. No room could hold them, no guard could prevent their departure. As one frustrated officer noted, "They are with us by choice, not by compulsion, and we would do well to remember that." By mid-1862, as the Civil War reached new levels of brutality, the triplets' appearances became more frequent, but also more troubling. They began arriving with visible signs of distress, nosebleeds, unexplained bruises, and a physical exhaustion that had not been present in their earlier manifestations. Dr. Holloway noted with growing concern that their extraordinary abilities seemed to be taking a physical toll. "The boys appear to be experiencing some form of sensory overload," he wrote in August 1862. "They describe being constantly bombarded with the emotional pain of thousands of dying and wounded soldiers. It is as if they cannot shield themselves from the suffering that surrounds them. I fear that their gift is becoming a form of torture." This period coincided with the triplets' first direct intervention in medical care. They began appearing in field hospitals, moving silently among the wounded soldiers. Nurses reported that the boys could identify with unerring accuracy which patients would survive and which were beyond saving. allowing medical resources to be directed where they would do the most good. More remarkably, they could detect infections before any physical symptoms appeared, sense internal bleeding that showed no external signs, and identify soldiers experiencing traumatic shock despite appearing physically stable. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first female physicians in America who briefly encountered the triplets at a hospital outside Washington, wrote, "These children represent something beyond our current understanding of human capability. They do not diagnose illness through conventional methods. They perceive it directly, as clearly as I might see a rash or identify a fever. What's more, they sense the emotional state of each patient with equal clarity, distinguishing between physical pain and psychological trauma with a precision our best doctors cannot match." The summer and fall of 1862 brought another evolution in the triplets' activities. They began to demonstrate abilities that went beyond passive perception and veered into active influence. Soldiers who had been treated in hospitals where the triplets appeared reported unusual experiences, accelerated healing, reduced pain, and most notably, an absence of the traumatic nightmares that plagued so many Civil War veterans. Medical records from 3 different field hospitals documented recovery rates significantly higher than comparable facilities. Wounds healed with fewer complications, infections occurred at lower rates, and psychological trauma appeared less severe among patients who had contact with the triplets. These effects were so pronounced that some doctors began requesting the boys' presence during difficult surgeries. When treating particularly severe cases, Dr. Holloway's observations during this period suggest a possible explanation. The triplets appear able to not only perceive emotional and physical distress, but potentially to absorb or redirect it in ways that benefit those around them. This capacity may explain their increasing physical symptoms. They are taking on some portion of others' suffering, though the mechanism by which this occurs remains completely unknown to medical science. As word of these healing effects spread through military circles, pressure increased to use the triplets more systematically in medical contexts. Plans were developed to establish specialized hospitals, where the boys would be permanently available to assist with treatment. Protocols were drafted for transporting critically wounded officers to locations where the triplets could attend to them. These plans reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the boys' nature. They continued to appear and disappear according to their own inscrutable logic, never remaining in one location for more than a few hours, never submitting to schedules or responding to summons. Military officials who attempted to predict or control their movements inevitably found themselves frustrated. What no one recognized at the time was that the triplets were engaged in a much larger and more complex intervention than merely providing military intelligence or medical assistance. Evidence compiled decades later from multiple sources suggests they were subtly influencing hundreds of key individuals across both Union and Confederate territories, appearing briefly to officers, politicians, journalists, and community leaders, imparting specific information or insights before vanishing again. The pattern only becomes visible when examining personal journals, letters, and memoirs from disparate sources across this period. Dozens of influential figures independently describe encounters with 3 identical boys who left them with new perspectives or crucial information that altered their decisions. These appearances followed no obvious strategic pattern until historian Dr. Rebecca Shun mapped them geographically and chronologically in her groundbreaking 2003 study. The triplets were conducting a massive coordinated intervention across the entire theater of war, Dr. Chun concluded. They were systematically identifying individuals whose decisions would have significant ripple effects and providing exactly the information needed to nudge those decisions toward outcomes that reduced overall casualties. It wasn't just military intelligence. They were engaging in a form of large-scale social engineering that required an understanding of cause and effect far beyond normal human capability. The winter of 1862 to 1863 marked a turning point in the triplet story. Their appearances became less frequent but more targeted. They began to focus their attention on a small group of scientific and medical professionals, individuals with the knowledge and resources to potentially understand the nature of their abilities. Dr. Holloway found himself at the center of this new phase, receiving multiple visits during which the boys seemed deliberately to be educating him rather than merely submitting to his tests. They are attempting to help us develop a framework for understanding perception that goes beyond our current scientific models, Holloway wrote in February 1863. They describe a world in which human emotions, intentions, and experiences create lasting imprints on physical reality, imprints that most of us cannot detect but which are as real and concrete as visible light or audible sound. They use the term emotional residue to describe these imprints and suggest that every human being possesses the latent capacity to perceive them, though few ever develop this ability. During this period, the triplets began sharing information about their own origins and nature. They confirmed that their mother, Elizabeth, had indeed possessed unusual perceptive abilities, though less developed than their own. They described how their shared consciousness had begun forming before birth, allowing them to experience themselves simultaneously as individuals and as parts of a greater whole. Most significantly, they revealed that their abilities had been dramatically enhanced by the circumstances of their birth during the remarkable astronomical event of October 1856. The meteor shower that coincided with our birth created electromagnetic conditions that altered our already unusual neurological development. They explained to Holloway in one documented session. The same phenomenon has occurred throughout human history during similar celestial events, producing individuals with enhanced perception. Most lived their lives without understanding their abilities or were dismissed as seers, prophets, or madmen. We represent something different because we were born as three rather than one, allowing us to compare and validate our perceptions. This explanation, combining natural phenomena with neurological development, offered the first scientific framework for understanding the triplets' abilities. Holloway, working with a small circle of trusted colleagues, began developing theories about electromagnetic sensitivity in the human brain and how certain rare conditions might enhance this sensitivity to the point where imperceptible information became accessible. The spring of 1863 brought a new development that would forever change the triplets' relationship with the government and military infrastructure that had been studying them. In March, President Lincoln signed a classified executive order establishing Project Perception, a long-term research initiative focused on understanding and potentially replicating the triplets' abilities for military and intelligence applications. The order included provisions for the secure housing and scientific study of the triplets, carefully worded bureaucratic language that essentially authorized their indefinite detention. Lincoln, convinced by military advisors of the strategic necessity of controlling such valuable intelligence assets, had reluctantly approved the measure despite his personal discomfort with the ethical implications. What none of the officials involved in Project Perception realized was that the triplets had perceived the plan's development long before the order was signed. They had observed the meetings, sensed the intentions, and prepared their response with characteristic thoroughness. On April 17, 1863, the triplets made their final documented appearance at Dr. Holloway's office in Washington. Unlike their previous visits, this one was announced in advance through a letter delivered to Holloway's home 3 days earlier. The doctor, recognizing the significance of this departure from their usual pattern, arranged to have a stenographer present to record the conversation. The transcript of this final meeting, preserved in the National Archives, reveals the full extent of the triplets' awareness and their plans for the future. "We have come to say goodbye," Dr. Holloway, Benjamin, began. Events have been set in motion that make our continued cooperation with government authorities impossible. Samuel continued seamlessly. We have known for some time that this moment would arrive. Those who see us as tools rather than as persons have gained influence. They wish to contain us, study us, and eventually recreate our abilities in others who would use them for purposes we cannot support. Christopher concluded, "We will not allow ourselves to become weapons." The suffering we have witnessed during this war has shown us the danger of allowing our perception to be directed by those who see only strategic advantage rather than human cost. Holloway, visibly distressed, asked where they intended to go and whether they would continue providing assistance to the medical corps at least, if not military intelligence. "We will go where we cannot be found," the triplets responded in unnerving unison. "But our work will continue in ways you cannot yet understand. We have identified others like ourselves, not identical in ability, but individuals born with heightened perception. Some are children now, others adults unaware of their potential. We will find them, teach them, and create a community that exists outside the structures of government and military power." When Holloway pressed for more specific information about these other individuals with unusual abilities, the triplets offered a response that researchers are still attempting to fully decipher. Throughout human history, approximately 1 in 10,000 children is born with neurological structures capable of perceiving emotional and intentional residues. Most never develop these abilities because their brains are not exposed to the specific conditions necessary for activation. But when certain environmental factors align, electromagnetic anomalies, specific chemical exposures, or extreme emotional circumstances during early development, these latent capacities can emerge. The war has created these conditions for dozens of children across America. Heightened emotional states in mothers during pregnancy, exposure to chemicals used in weapons manufacturing, and electromagnetic disruptions from telegraph systems have combined to activate these abilities in a new generation. They are awakening now, confused by what they perceive, often dismissed as imaginative or troubled. We will find them before they are broken by a world that cannot understand what they experience. The triplets then made a prediction that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government when Holloway's transcript reached Washington. Project Perception will fail. Every subject identified and studied will demonstrate no unusual abilities under laboratory conditions. Every attempt to recreate our capabilities through training or chemical enhancement will produce nothing of value. You cannot manufacture what we are, and those born with our potential will remain hidden from you. Their final words before departing Holloway's office for the last time were perhaps the most disturbing. "We have seen possible futures, Dr. Holloway. In some, our abilities are weaponized, leading to forms of conflict more terrible than anything in human history. In others, perception, like ours, becomes a force for healing and understanding. The choice between these futures begins now, with what you and others do after we are gone. Remember that we will know your choice, even when you believe no one is watching." The triplets vanished from Holloway's office while his attention was momentarily distracted by a commotion in the hallway outside. A distraction that several witnesses later suggested had been somehow orchestrated by the boys themselves. Despite an immediate lockdown of the building and surrounding streets, no trace of them was found. Project Perception proceeded as planned despite the triplets' disappearance and warning. Research facilities were established in Maryland, New York, and Illinois, each focused on different aspects of extraordinary perception. Children with unusual sensory sensitivity or reported precognitive experiences were identified and brought in for testing. Chemical compounds based on analyses of blood samples previously collected from the triplets were developed and tested on military volunteers. Just as the triplets had predicted, these efforts produced no significant results. After 2 years of intensive research and enormous expenditure, Project Perception was quietly shut down in 1865, its records sealed and its facilities repurposed for other research. The official conclusion, documented in a final report to President Johnson after Lincoln's assassination, was that the triplets represented a completely unique phenomenon that could not be replicated or fully explained with current scientific understanding. Dr. Holloway, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the research, resigned from government service in late 1863 and established a private medical practice in rural Pennsylvania. His journals from this period reveal a man haunted by his experiences with the triplets and deeply concerned about the ethical implications of the government's attempts to weaponize their abilities. "I am now convinced that the boys were right to disappear," he wrote in December 1863. "What I have witnessed in the Project Perception laboratories fills me with profound unease. The researchers speak of the triplets as phenomena rather than children, as resources to be exploited rather than beings with their own agency and purpose. I fear we have learned nothing from our brief contact with minds so different from our own except the desire to bend such differences to our advantage." The end of the Civil War in 1865 might have brought the story of the Millersport triplets to a close, consigning them to a classified footnote in military history. But their disappearance from official records marked only the beginning of their true impact on American society. Though they had vanished from the view of authorities, evidence suggests they had embarked on a much more ambitious project than anyone had imagined. The first hints of this new phase emerged in 1866 when communities across America began reporting encounters with three identical young men who appeared without warning to help resolve local crises. In a farming community in Iowa devastated by crop failure, they identified previously unknown water sources that saved the settlement from abandonment. In a Colorado mining town suffering from a mysterious illness, they pinpointed the contaminated water supply before medical authorities had recognized the pattern. In a New Orleans neighborhood torn by racial violence following the war, they mediated between factions by revealing hidden connections and shared interests that created the foundation for reconciliation. These incidents shared common elements. The young men arrived with knowledge no outsiders could possess, provided precisely the information needed to resolve the immediate crisis, and disappeared once the situation had stabilized. They accepted no payment or recognition, and often specifically requested that their involvement remain private. Only decades later, when historian Thomas Blackwood began cataloging these incidents for his 1907 book, The Invisible Benefactors, did the pattern become clear. The triplets had created a nationwide network of intervention, systematically identifying communities in crisis and providing targeted assistance that often prevented greater disasters. What emerges from these collected accounts is not random charity but a coordinated program of social stabilization, Blackwood wrote. The triplets appear to have developed a methodology for identifying critical stress points in the post-war social fabric where small interventions could prevent larger collapses. Their work constitutes a form of social engineering unprecedented in its precision and effectiveness. More intriguing still were the occasional reports of children or young adults who accompanied the triplets during these interventions, individuals who demonstrated similar if less developed perceptive abilities. Contemporary accounts described these companions as quiet, intensely observant, and eerily composed regardless of the chaos around them. They appeared to be learning from the triplets, observing their methods and occasionally participating under their guidance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.